The well at Dusk, on the western coast of Ireland, where the salt wind combs the tall grass and clouds drift slowly past like sheep made of light, there was a small village called Ronan. It appeared on very few maps. Sometimes even travellers crossing the region couldn't quite say when they had arrived. The road would narrow between moss-covered stone walls, then bend past a stand of old hawthorns and finally open out onto a handful of whitewashed houses with dark rooftops, patient chimneys, and windows that in the evening held the firelight as though keeping watch over a domestic star. Ronan was a place of small customs. People spoke in low voices at dawn. They greeted the bread before cutting it. A corner of every garden was left untouched, so that the quiet creatures of the old world might find passage and rest. Children soon learned to tell gentle rain from the restless kind, and the elders, when they sat facing the sea, could spend a whole hour watching a strip of grey water and find in it conversation enough. In the middle of the village, set slightly apart from the square and the blacksmith's forge, there was a very old well. It was not large. It was not surrounded by wealth or any eye-catching adornment. It had a rounded stone coping worn smooth by many hands, and fine ferns grew from its edges, trembling even when the air seemed still. An old ash tree sheltered it, leaning its branches down as though to better hear what happened below. In summer, the tree's shadow drew a cool circle around the well. In winter, frost traced white edges along the stone, and the water at the bottom stayed dark, wakeful, serene. The people of Ronan called it Tobar na Gealtanas Biaga, the well of small promises. No one could remember what started the custom. Some said it went back to times before the village stone church, before even the cart track and the ruined tower that could be seen to the north, up on the hill. Others maintained that it had been a woman of the Olo Ware clan centuries ago, who understood that grand oaths weigh too heavily and often break, while small promises made with honesty can sustain a whole life. The elders didn't argue either version. They simply smiled, because in Ronan, what mattered was not the origin but the repeated gesture. On the first Monday of every month, and also on the eves of winter, of the planting season, and of the gentle summer solstice, the villagers would come to the well. They brought no offerings of gold and asked for no riches. They claimed no bountiful harvests, no victories, no loud favors. Instead, they brought tiny promises. Promises that barely make a sound when spoken. Today I will listen before I answer. Tomorrow I will walk more slowly. I will be kind to those who are tired. I will not close my heart over a small hurt. I will breathe deeply when fear comes to visit. I will share the bread. I will look at the sky before I sleep. Each person would lean over the coping, letting fall a drop of milk, a sprig of thyme, a petal, a strand of wool, or simply the warmth of their hands against the stone, and would murmur their promise. Then they would step back without expecting any miracle. No music, no grand ceremony, only the well, the ash tree, the murmur of water far below, and the quiet echo of something offered in truth. And yet, for generations, everyone knew that the well gave something back. Not in any spectacular way. It did not heal wounds overnight. It neither prevented death nor stilled the Atlantic storms. Its gift was lighter than that, and for that very reason, deeper. The well gave back a quiet kind of courage. To the one who promised to breathe slowly, it offered a little calm when difficult news arrived. To the one who promised to be kind, it placed in their hands the patience needed not to harden. To the one who promised to listen, it offered the courage to hear truths that sometimes hurt and still remain. It was a discreet kind of courage, the kind that isn't put on display, the kind that helps you rise, carry on, light the lamp at dusk, cross a long winter without losing tenderness. In that village there lived a young woman named Eadawan. She was 19, with hair the colour of hazelnuts cracked open in the rain. Her eyes were neither entirely grey nor entirely green. They shifted with the weather, the way the sea does along the coast. She lived with her grandmother, Brid, in a low house near the cliffs, where the air always carried the faint smell of salt, dry wool, and freshly baked oat bread. Her mother had died when she was small. Her father was a sailor who had not returned for 3 winters now. Not out of abandonment, but in that strange way the sea sometimes keeps men for a very long time, carrying them from port to port, job to job, until they become almost a legend at their own family table. Eadawan helped her grandmother with the garden, mended clothes for several houses in the village, gathered herbs on the hills, and knew the name of nearly every bird in the area. She was not a loud young woman, nor a sad one, but she lived with a kind of small knot in her chest. It didn't suffocate her. It was simply there, like a smooth stone kept in a pocket. Sometimes the knot woke before dawn, before the cock crowed. Sometimes it arrived when someone knocked at the door with news that might be good or bad. Sometimes it appeared when the west wind blew very hard and the windows rattled, reminding her that the world was wide and uncertain, and that nothing stayed still for very long. Brid, who noticed more than she asked, watched her for months without pressing. The old woman had knotted, precise hands. When she sewed, she seemed to be mending not just a sleeve or a hem, but the invisible fabric of the hours. One late summer afternoon, while they were shelling peas by the door, she said gently, "Your breathing is running ahead of you, child." Eadawan looked up and smiled slightly, though without real surprise. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to those who love you," Brid answered. The sky was covered by a thin layer of pale clouds. The faint tinkling of sheep drifted down from the hill. In the village, someone was chopping wood. Each blow of the axe seemed to come from very far away. Eadawan worked in silence a moment before speaking. "I'm not unhappy, grandmother. I know that. It's just that sometimes I feel as though everything can go wrong too easily. As if good things were full jugs you have to carry along a stony path." Brid set a handful of pods in the basket and wiped their hands on her apron. "The well knows that too." Eadawan didn't answer right away. She looked toward the center of the village, though from there she could not see the ash tree or the stone coping. Since childhood, she had accompanied others to make their small promises. She had heard a neighbor promise not to speak harshly to her sister. She had listened to a fisherman vow never to put to sea without saying goodbye to his wife with a hand on her shoulder. She had watched a 7-year-old girl promise not to pull up flowers out of boredom, but she herself had never offered a promise of her own. Not a real one. It seemed to her that promises required a clarity she did not yet possess. "What if I don't know what to promise?" she asked at last. Brid looked at her the way you look at a fire when you already know what wood it needs, and then you'll promise something small enough to keep. That night, Eadawan was slow to fall asleep. The wind turned several times around the house, brushing the chimney with a low, round sound. The embers died slowly. Her grandmother breathed with the ancient rhythm of someone who has made peace with many things. Eadawan, by contrast, lay with her eyes open in the dark. She thought about the news that never came regarding her father. She thought about the possibility of one day loving something she might lose. She thought about the coming winter, the long rains, Brid's age, the trembling in her own hands when she felt watched, or when some small uncertainty expanded inside her. And then she understood that she did not need a grand promise. She needed a humble one. The following morning, before the rest of the village stirred, she went out alone toward the well. The light was blue and soft. The rooftop still held the night's dampness. A cow lowed in a nearby field. Passing the church, she heard the soft scrape of a broom on stone. It was the world waking, slowly, without hurry. When she reached the ash tree, the air felt cooler underneath it. The leaves held a faint sheen. The stone coping was cold to the touch. Eadawen placed both hands on it, closed her eyes, and listened. She heard no words, only water, deep water. Still water moving so slowly it was almost like thought. For a moment she felt embarrassed, alone, speaking to a dark depth, entrusting something so ancient with a worry so human and so small. But the embarrassment faded. The ash tree murmured with the smallest gust. A drop fell somewhere at the bottom. Eadawen drew a careful breath. "I promise," she said very softly, "that when I feel afraid, before I imagine the worst, I will breathe slowly 3 times." She stood still. She added nothing more. She asked for no reward. She left on the stone a thread of blue wool that had been tied around her wrist for weeks. And when she let it go, she felt a humble lightness. The kind that comes from setting down a basket you have carried for a long time. Then something happened. It was not a light. It was not a voice. Not even any visible change in the water. It was more subtle than that. The small knot in her chest did not disappear, but it loosened just a little. Enough for the air to pass more freely. Enough for the morning to feel wider. Eadawen opened her eyes. The surface of the well remained dark, serene, ancient, and yet she knew, with that quiet certainty that sometimes arrives without argument, that something had been heard. She walked home slowly. She found Brid kneading bread. "You've been," the old woman said, without turning. Eadawen leaned against the door frame. "Yes. And what did you promise?" The young woman hesitated a moment, as though naming it aloud might break the fragility of the gesture. "To breathe slowly 3 times before letting fear speak for me." Brid nodded, as though she had just heard an old tune remembered well. "That is a good promise. It fits in a single morning, and in a whole life as well." The days that followed did not become an easy story. There were still buckets to fill, wool to wash, neighbors with shifting moods, windy afternoons and nights when the sea beat against the rocks below as though trying to enter every house at once. But Eadawen began to notice things. When a dog appeared barking behind her on a narrow path, she felt the jolt of fright, and before she could get angry or run, she breathed once, twice, 3 times. The fright shrank. When a neighbor arrived with news of a boat delayed off the southern coast, the old fear tried to raise its voice at once. Eadawen pressed her fingers into her apron and breathed 3 times. The worry did not disappear, but she could carry on chopping onions. She could wait without coming undone. When she noticed at night that Brid seemed to be coughing rather a lot, she breathed as well. And instead of lying awake in anguish until dawn, she warmed water with honey, tucked her grandmother in more carefully, and let the darkness be only darkness, not a threat. The village, meanwhile, continued its slow life. Hens pecked among puddles. The blacksmith nearly always sang the same tune. The baker left her loaves to cool on linen cloths. And under the ash tree, the well went on receiving small promises, one after another, the way someone gathers seeds and stores them patiently for the cold months. Continue. September arrived with its slanting light. The afternoons turned golden first, then copper. Blackberries appeared in the hedgerows, black and bright. Children came and went with stained fingers and dark lips, glad for that brief disorder the end of summer always allows. In the meadows the cattle moved with a thick calm, and as evening fell, the smoke from the chimneys began to rise a little earlier, as if the houses were calling out to one another in the half-light. Eadawen kept up her promise. Sometimes she forgot. One morning, accidentally tipping over a basket of freshly picked apples, she let out a cry of frustration before she remembered to breathe. Another afternoon, she let herself be pulled along by a small worry and spent a good while imagining letters that never came, storms that perhaps didn't exist, and tired faces in distant port. But then she would remember, and she would return. She always returned. That was something Breed would repeat while cutting carrots or stoking the fire. A small promise doesn't ask for perfection, only for return. Ead Owen kept that saying the way you keep a warm stone in your pocket. In Silronan, autumn brought a particular custom. Before Samhain, every family cleaned a little more than was strictly necessary. They didn't only sweep houses and yards, they also cleared old words, crooked silences, the small frictions the year had left between people. Not out of obligation, but because, so they said, when the dark season opened its door, it was better to receive it with space in the heart and the inner house well aired. So, a few weeks before the night of the candles in the windows, the village would gather at the well in a quiet assembly. It was not a festival, nor a solemn rite. It was more like a meeting of soft recollection. Each person brought something simple, a sprig of rosemary, a spoonful of milk, a piece of thread, a low song, an intention. That afternoon the sky was covered by high, pale clouds. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly fallen leaves. Eadawan walked with Breed to the ash tree. A dozen neighbours were already there. Muren the baker, with flour on the cuffs of her skirt. Seamus the blacksmith, enormous and surprisingly gentle in his step. The twins Nessa and Fiona, who always seemed to share some cheerful secret. Padraig the shepherd in his wool cap with his quietly dreaming eyes. And also the schoolmaster Cian, who taught the children letters and tides with equal respect. One by one they came to the coping. Muren promised not to rush her hands when tiredness made her brusque. Seamus promised to speak kindly to his younger brother, toward whom he had been cold all summer. One of the twins promised not to mock a cousin's stammer. Padraig promised to rest a little more and not carry every burden alone. The schoolmaster Cian promised to listen patiently to those who learned slowly. No one applauded, no one commented. The promises fell into the well the way seeds fall into good earth. When her turn came, Eadawan placed her hand on the stone and felt less embarrassment than the first time. The ash tree smelled of sap and cold. She said quietly, "I promise to keep breathing slowly before I feed my fears, and I promise to add something more. When I see fear in another person, I will not hurry them past it." As she said it, she thought of Brid. She thought of herself. She thought of all the impatient gestures with which we sometimes try to pull from another, a calm that isn't yet ready to bloom. She let a hazel leaf fall into the well. Then the wind turned once around the tree and moved the branches with a murmur that seemed like a scent. Later, on the way home, Brid walked slowly. Her stick pressed its tip into the damp earth with such a steady rhythm that it almost seemed the second beat of a song. "The well has heard you again," she said. Eadawan smiled. "Do you always know?" "Not always, but I know when someone comes back more whole than they left." The days passed. Samhain drew near with its long nights and burning sunsets. In the village, people began storing more peat, hanging dried herbs, checking cloaks and blankets. Conversations grew more inward, lamps more cherished. One rainy afternoon, while Eadawan was mending a shawl by the window, she heard voices at the door. Two children, brothers, brought a message from the far northern end of the road. An older woman, Mair, had fallen ill with exhaustion and a mild fever. Nothing grave, perhaps, but she had lived alone since the previous winter, and the boys had gone from house to house to find someone who could help with broth, firewood, and the tending of the sheep. Eadawan set down her sewing at once. "I'll go," she said. Brid looked up. "Take the blue blanket too, the thick wool one." The path to Mair's house was long and wet. The fine rain seemed to float rather than fall. The fields were covered in a dark, shining green. In places, mist curled along the ground, as though wanting to sleep there. Eadawan brought the blanket, a pot of barley and leek broth, and a small bunch of thyme. Mare was a woman with small hands and a curved back. She had the habit of speaking to her hens as though they were scatterbrained nieces. When Eadawan came in, she found her sitting beside a nearly dead fire, her face pale but her eyes still bright. "You didn't need to come in this weather," she murmured. "Of course I did," Eadawan replied, setting the pot on the table. She built up the fire, opened the window a little to let in fresh air, warmed the broth, and covered Mare with the blue blanket. She did everything without hurry, with a new calm that she noticed in herself. Before, a situation like this would have stirred a rush of anxious questions. What if she gets worse? What if I don't know what to do? What if she's left alone at night and no one hears? But now, those questions didn't disappear entirely. They simply stopped tripping over each other. She breathed, she listened, she acted first on what was within her reach. Mare took 2 spoonfuls of broth and closed her eyes. "Your mother moved like that," she said at last, as though things didn't push her from behind. Eadawan felt a tender pang. "I don't remember her much." "I do," the old woman answered. She had a calm that wasn't slowness, it was trust. She knew that every task deserves its own pace. The rain continued to beat the roof. Eadawan stayed until evening, tidying the table, sweeping the hearthside, checking the firewood. Before leaving, she set clean water beside the bed and let the nearest neighbors know they should take turns the following day. Walking home in the dark, the sky had cleared. Between the open clouds appeared cold, sharp stars. The air smelled of damp peat and distant sea. Eadawan walked with wet shoulders, but her chest strangely light. She understood something then. The quiet courage of the well was not a suit of armor. It was a small flame. It did not stop the wind from blowing. It did not make the world a safe place. But it allowed you to carry a light without it going out at the first gust. When she arrived, Breed was by the hearth, darning a stocking. "Mare will eat tonight," said Eadawan, taking off her cloak. "Good. And they will come to see her tomorrow." "Good." Eadawan left her clogs near the fire. Then, not quite knowing why, she sat at her grandmother's feet, rested her head on her knees, and let out a long breath. Breed went on sewing for a moment. Then she ran her hand through the girl's hair with a slowness so ancient it seemed handed down through many mothers. "You're beginning to understand," she murmured. "I think so. Tell me." Eadawan listened to the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind began once more its rounds around the corners of the house. "It's not about stopping the fear," she said at last. "It's about not obeying it so quickly." Brad set the needle in her lap and smiled with barely her mouth. "That's it exactly." The eve of Samhain arrived clear and cold. The whole village spent the day in quiet preparation. Doorsteps were swept. Candles were set ready in the windows. Chairs were placed beside the hearth, as always, out of courtesy for the absent, the remembered, for everything that still deserved a place, even if it could not be seen. Women hung strings of onions and dried herbs. Men brought more peat and checked the shutters. The children, excited but half subdued by the mood of the day, received the usual warning not to shout near the well or run around the ash tree. That evening before supper, Eadawan slipped out alone for a moment. The village was full of small lights. Each window shone with a modest gold. The air carried the smell of bread, smoke, and baked apple. She made her way to the center and stood a moment under the tree. The well was barely a dark circle amid the reflection of the candles. "Thank you," she whispered, not quite knowing whether she was thanking the water, the ash tree, the ancient custom, or simply the fact of having found a livable way to inhabit her days. A robin hopped on a low branch, hunched against the cold. It looked at her with one bright eye. Then it flew toward the hedge. Eadawan went home. That night she dreamed of a plain covered in soft mist. In the middle stood a well. It was not exactly the one in Silhonan, but it resembled it. From the coping hung hundreds of tiny threads of every color, swaying without sound. Each thread was a promise, some shone, others were barely visible, and yet together they formed a kind of light cloak that covered the entire village. When she woke, the image stayed with her the way a song lingers after it ends. Continue. Winter arrived without abruptness. First it came at the edges of the leaves, then in the visible breath at dawn, then in the way the mud held a footprint longer than before. In Sil Ronan, no one was surprised by that slow advance. The cold there was no intruder. It was an expected guest, sometimes severe, but known. It was received with dry firewood, thick soups, well-mended cloaks, and a certain ancient humility. In the house of Eadawan and Bride, the days turned more inward. There was more sewing by the fire, more sage tea, more weightless shared silences. In the mornings, Eadawan went out for water, checked the small hen house, turned the garden soil when the weather allowed, and then helped wherever she was needed. Sometimes she mended clothes, other times she brought broth, other times she gathered rushes or bandaged the leg of a restless goat. She liked that network of small tasks. It gave her the feeling that the village breathed like a single body, with many different chests and one deep shared rhythm. The custom of the well continued. On the frozen mornings, the stone was white at its edges. The ash tree, nearly bare by now, let a clean sky show through its dark branches. Promises were spoken in visible breath. Some were new, others were repeated month after month, because there are humble commitments that are not kept once, but every day. Eadawan kept to hers. Breathe 3 times before feeding the fear. Do not rush another person's fear. By repeating it so often, the promise began to take on a life of its own inside her. Sometimes it took only the smallest sensation, a change in the light, an unexpected sound, for her chest to want to close, and then her body remembered before her mind did. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. And in that brief space, the world regained its proportion. One January midday, when the sea was particularly grey and low clouds rested on the horizon like damp blankets, an uncertain piece of news came to the village. A man had been seen at the southern cove asking for Sil Ronan. It was not entirely unusual for travellers to pass through, but this one had a surname that rang familiar in the tavern and the forge. Someone said they had heard the name Thomas O'Dalaig, Eadawan's father. The news moved through the village with that speed only whispered things have, passed from door to door. It was not certain. It had not come in a letter. It had not been brought by a trusted neighbour. And yet, when Seamus stopped by Breed's house to deliver it carefully, the air inside the kitchen changed. Eadawan, who was cutting turnips, felt the familiar trembling, first in her stomach, then in her throat, then in her hands. It might be true, it might not be. He might have returned injured. He might have gone away again. It might be another man with a similar name. All of that rose at once, like gulls taking flight. Brid watched her without interrupting Seamus. "Thank you for bringing it carefully," the old woman said. The blacksmith removed his cap. "I didn't want you to hear it from more twisted rumors." When he left, the kitchen fell silent. Only the simmering of the broth could be heard. Eadawan pressed both hands flat on the table. She noticed that her whole body wanted to race ahead of time, to run south, to ask, to imagine, to fear, to cling. And then she remembered, one breath, then another, and a third. It was not magic. The questions were still there. Her heart still beat harder than usual, but fear was no longer holding the reins. "I'm going to put more wood on the fire," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Brid nodded. "And then we'll go and find out what there is to know." They went to the tavern, which at that hour still smelled of damp barley and early broth. There they found Eamon, a carter who had come from the cove. The man confirmed that yes, he had spoken to a traveller, that yes, the surname was O'Daleg, but he wasn't sure of the first name. The man was heading inland. He had asked for directions. He looked tired, though not ill. He was on foot and carried a blue bundle. It wasn't much, nothing definitive. Even so, the news kindled an old ember. Eadwan felt like crying, like laughing, like running. Instead, she breathed again. She asked about the route. She gave her thanks. She went out into the frozen air. Breed followed with a slow step. "You don't know if it's him," she said gently. "I know. And you don't know if he'll arrive today. I know." The young woman looked at the road coming from the south, a ribbon of mud and stone between low walls. "But something in me has already started running." Breed took her gloved hand. "Then we'll walk to the well first." Yet Owen would have preferred to set off at once toward the fields, but her grandmother's voice had that steadiness that doesn't push but guides. They went together to the ash tree. The air was so cold it seemed to crack as it entered the nose. The well was dark as a pupil. Yadawan rested her forehead for a moment against the stone. "I don't know what to promise now," she whispered. Breed, beside her, said, "Promise not to let yourself be carried away by either hope or fear before their time." The young woman closed her eyes. It seemed a difficult promise, and precisely because of that, a necessary one. "I promise to receive whatever comes with an open heart and still feet," she said to the well. "I promise not to invent misfortunes. I promise not to invent miracles. Simply wait in truth." The wind came down from the hill and turned around the coping. A sensation of simple clarity settled inside her. Not yet joy, not relief, only space. They stayed a while longer beside the well. Then they went home and continued the day. That was perhaps the most courageous thing, to wait without drama. Peel potatoes, sweep, fold cloths, scatter grain for the hens, keep the table set for 2, and then for 3, just in case, without turning every minute into a drumbeat. As evening fell, when the sky was already shifting from grey to deep blue, someone knocked at the door. Not a hard knock, 3 measured raps, like those of a tired person who still wants to be polite. Eadawain went still. Breed looked at her, and neither of them ran. The young woman breathed once, twice, 3 times. She went to the door and opened it. There stood a tall man, thinner than in her few memories of him, his beard flecked with grey, his face weathered by wind and years at sea. He wore a dark cloak, wet at the edges. In one hand he held a blue bundle, in the other his cap pressed flat against his chest. His eyes were hers, not exactly the same, but close enough. "Eadwan," he said, and in that single word there was wonder, tenderness, and an old grief for the time lost. She felt the world narrow and open at the same time. She did not speak at once, not because she didn't want to, but because her whole life of waiting had just changed shape and she needed a moment to find where to put her feet. She breathed, and then she smiled. Not a wide smile, but one of those that begin in the eyes and reach the mouth the way light climbs a window. "You've been a long time," she murmured. The man let out a short, broken laugh. "Yes." "He tardado demasiado." Breed appeared behind her. "Come in before winter finishes freezing your back, Tomas," she said, as if only a few weeks had passed, and that merciful ordinariness made something loosen in all of them. The house soon filled with the smell of wet clothes and living fire. Tomas sat close to the hearth. Breed served him broth. Eadawan hung his cloak to dry. No one asked the great questions at first. It was better that way. The body needs, before explanations, a chair, warmth, and something to put in the mouth. Only later, when the night had settled and the wind beat outside, did Thomas tell his story with the simplicity of someone who has learned that pain needs no ornament. There were storms, there were jobs in distant ports, there were others' debts that held him back. There was a mild but long illness, there were lost letters, there was shame at not returning sooner, and there was, above all, a constant wish to come home that did not always find its way. Eadwine listened. There were moments when she felt a pang for the absent years. There were others when she wanted to ask him why he hadn't tried harder, why he hadn't sent someone, why he had let the silence grow so long. But she remembered her second promise. Do not rush another person's fear. Do not force a truth out all at once. So she listened. And in that listening, she found another form of courage. Tomas, with his hands around the bowl, looked up at her. I'm not asking for everything to be easy, daughter. The word hung in the warm air of the kitchen. I only ask for time, he added. Eadwine felt the weight and tenderness of that request. She looked at Breed. Her grandmother, by the fire, said nothing, but her eyes held the calm of someone who recognizes an important crossroads and knows no one can walk another person's path. Time, yes, Eadwine answered at last, that I can give. Thomas bowed his head. The fire crackled. Outside, the world remained cold and wide. Inside the house, the night found a way to rest. Later, when her father was asleep in the small room where they used to store sacks of oats, Eadwine stepped out for a moment to the threshold. The sky was clear. The stars seemed pinned into a silence of ice. From the center of the village, barely visible in the dark, she thought she could make out the silhouette of the ash tree. She thought about the well. She thought about her promise not to invent miracles or misfortunes. And she understood that the well had not given her exactly what a girl might have asked for years ago. It had given her something more useful, the capacity to receive what is real without coming undone. Continue. The days that followed had a strange softness. Not because everything was easy. It was not. When an absence has lasted that long, the homecoming does not on its own mend the broken years. There are silences that still don't know where to sit. There are questions watching from the corners. There are settled customs that must make room for a presence that is at once old and new. But in Breed's house there was an old wisdom. Do not ask the heart to resolve in one night what time has woven across many seasons. So they let the living together find its own rhythm. Tomas helped mend the garden fence. He cleaned the gutters. He fixed a hinge that had been complaining for months. He brought wood. He walked with Brid to the church on a cold Sunday. Sometimes he told something of the ports where he had been. Other times he sat silent, looking at the fire as though he still had salt inside his bones. Eadwine, for her part, was learning to be near him without rushing toward a complete affection or withdrawing out of pride. She watched him as he peeled turnips, leaned over a rope, laughed with Seamus in the tavern, went still when the wind came from the west. She discovered resemblances. The line of his jaw, the way he raised an eyebrow when he heard something doubtful. She also discovered differences because time returns no one intact. One afternoon, while they were both chopping wood behind the house, Thomas left the axe wedged in a stump and said, Your grandmother told me about the well. Eadwine stacked 2 logs before answering. What did she tell you? That you've made a good promise, and that perhaps I should go myself. The young woman smiled faintly. Perhaps. He rubbed his hands together to warm them. When I was a boy, I went with my mother. I promised not to steal any more plums from the neighbor's garden. And did you keep it? Thomas let out a short laugh. I kept it for a whole month. Then I stole just one. But I shared it with my sister, so I still argue with myself to this day whether that broke the promise entirely. Yet Owen burst out laughing, a clean laugh, without reserve. And that sound, so simple, opened a quiet bridge between them. The well prefers honesty to perfection, she said. Then I still have hope. That very afternoon, when the sky was turning the color of pearl, they walked together to the ash tree. The village seemed gathered into itself. Blue smoke rose from the chimneys. A distant bell marked the hour with round strokes. The well waited beneath its bare branches. Tomas removed his cap and stepped forward. He stood without speaking for a long while. Eadawan, a few steps away, did not want to hear more than she should. She looked at the wet stones, a speck of frost in the shadow, the way the afternoon light sank into the coping. At last her father bowed his head and murmured something. Then he left an old coin on the stone, not as payment but as a keepsake, and turned away. They walked back without hurry. "What did you promise?" Eadawan asked when they were almost home. Toma glanced at her sideways. "I promised not to hide inside my shame when what I should do is show up." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a big promise, which is why I broke it into small pieces," he answered. "Tomorrow I'll start by showing up truly before you, without adornment." Y así fue. Aquella noche, junto al fuego, Tomás habló de cosas que le pesaban. No intentó parecer mejor. No buscó excusas brillantes. Nombró sus errores con la misma mano abierta con la que uno muestra una herida curada pero sensible. Eadawan listened. A veces lloró, a veces hizo preguntas, a veces pidió pausa. Todo eso cabía. In the weeks that followed, something began to mend. Not perfectly, but truly. Meanwhile, the village kept coming to the well, and winter advanced. There were days of hard rain and days of sky as clear as glass. A stray sheep was found sleeping in someone else's shed. There was a small wedding at the Kelleher cousins' house with quiet fiddle music and bread spread with thick butter. There was a birth in the small hours, during which Murin the baker, who had raised 4 children already and lost her fear of nearly everything, helped with such firm serenity that afterwards more than one woman went to the well to promise patience for her own future nights. In early February, when the first signs of imbulk were beginning to stir beneath the ground, Breed fell ill. It did not happen suddenly. First she coughed more than usual, then she tired climbing the short step to the door. Then one morning she said, a little too carelessly, that the fire was heavy on her eyes. Eadawan noticed before the old woman admitted anything. So did Tomas. Between them they began taking on her tasks, bringing her meals earlier, asking her to stay seated. Brid accepted little. Like most strong old people, she distrusted enforced rest. One night, however, fever painted color onto her cheeks and a strange brightness in her gaze. Eadawan felt again that old interior movement, the urge to rush toward the worst, the temptation to imagine absences before their time. The house was silent. The wind had gone still. Breed's uneven breathing from the bedroom could be heard very clearly. Eadawan went to the kitchen and pressed her hands on the table. She breathed, una vez, dos, tres. Then she prepared hot water. She dampened cloths. She woke Tomas with a calm voice. She sent for Meyer, who knew herbs and fevers better than anyone since her own recovery in the autumn. She did everything that needed doing. By dawn, Breed was still tired, but the fever had eased a little. Meyer, sitting by the fire with a cup in her hands, looked at Eadawan with silent approval. "Your promise is well tended," she said at last. Eadawan smiled with tiredness. "Sometimes I think it's the promise that holds me up." "That's how the best ones work," the old woman answered. Breed took several days to regain her strength. During that time, the house moved around her with slower steps. Tomas cooked with uneven but decent results. Eadawan made herbal teas, aired the room when the air grew stale, gently combed her grandmother's white hair, and read aloud to her in a low voice from old local stories. those that blended saints, fairies, impossible seas, and cattle with better judgment than some men. On one of those quiet afternoons, Brid opened her eyes and said, "When I was a girl, my mother took me to the well for the first time. I was afraid of the dark." Eadawan set the comb on the table. "You've never told me that." "It wasn't time yet." The old woman settled her blanket more comfortably. "I promised not to run from room to room when the candle was put out. It seemed impossible to me, but it was a small promise. Only that. Not to run, to feel my feet on the floor, to learn that the night is also a kind of home. Eadawan listened the way you listen when you hear the root of a familiar song." "And did the well help you?" Brid smiled. "It gave me the courage not to fight every shadow. Over the years, I came to understand that kind of courage serves for much more than crossing a dark room." The young woman took her grandmother's hand. "I think you're beginning to resemble the well more than any person." "What a beautiful insult," said Brid, and both of them laughed softly so as not to tire her. When the old woman was well enough, she wanted to go to the ash tree. It was still too early for a long walk, so Tomas and Eadawan accompanied her slowly, one on each side, on a clear morning at the end of winter. Frost still lay in the ditches, but in some sheltered spots green tips were already showing, timid and bright as though the earth were breathing beneath the cold. When they reached the well, Brid placed one hand on the stone and closed her eyes. She didn't say her promise straight away. The silence around her was so still that even the birds seemed to respect it. Then she murmured, "I promise to accept help without mistaking it for loss." Thomas bowed his head. Eadawan felt a deep emotion rise slowly in her chest. It was a very humble promise, and a very courageous one. The water in the well far below let out a faint echo. "Continue." With March came a wider light. It was not yet the fullness of spring, but its faithful announcement. The air was still cool at dawn, though it no longer bit in the same way. The fields began showing a new green, more tender, almost transparent in places. Birdsong returned before the sun rose. Along the edges of paths appeared white snowdrops and the first shoots of wild garlic. Pregnant ewes sought dry corners. The whole village seemed to stretch itself awake in silence. Brid regained her strength little by little. She still tired quickly, but she was back to arguing with good humor about the exact amount of salt in the broth, which for Eadawan was an excellent sign. Tomas, more settled now in the house, found ways to be useful without filling too much of the space. He had learned, perhaps, thanks to his promise, to show up without taking over. Sometimes that kind of delicacy is a deeper form of love than words. One clear morning, while Eadawan was drawing water from the small well in her yard, she heard cheerful voices on the road. It was the twins Nessa and Fiona, followed by 3 other children and the schoolmaster Cian, who walked with his hands behind his back. "We're going to the Great Well," Nessa announced. "Today we'll teach the little ones." In Silronan, when children reached a certain age, they were invited to make their first small promise with full awareness. It was not a solemn rite, but it was an important one. Until then, they had accompanied parents and grandparents, watched, listened to stories about the ash tree and the deep water. But there came a day when they had to choose for themselves a humble gesture they wished to tend. Eadawan set down the bucket and joined them. The children were a little nervous. One kept scratching his ear. Another squeezed a handkerchief between her fingers. The smallest one looked all around with wide eyes, as though at any moment a white deer or a woman from the old people might step out from behind the stone wall with her hair full of dew. When they reached the ash tree, the schoolmaster Cian spoke in that calm voice of his that seemed made for the world to fit together more easily. "This isn't about choosing something impressive," he said. "The well listens better to sincere things than to grandiose ones." The children nodded without fully understanding the last word, but grasping the meaning. The first was a freckled girl named Sorsha. She stepped forward, placed her hand on the stone, and whispered that she promised not to hide the sweet bread her mother baked in order to share it only with her favorite brother. Then she left a daisy. The second, whose boots were always full of mud, promised not to shout at his dog when the dog only wanted to play. The smallest one, after much thought, promised to go to sleep without asking for 3 invented glasses of water each night to put off bedtime. Everyone smiled, including the schoolmaster. Eadwan watched the scene with a deep tenderness. She understood that the whole village was woven from those small threads, not from memorable deeds, but from the patient accumulation of people trying to treat their own rougher edges with gentleness. When they were done, Sorsha came to Eadwan. "And what did you promise, the first real time?" Eadwan looked at the coping. The wind was already moving small new leaves on the ash tree. "I promised to breathe slowly 3 times whenever I felt afraid." The girl furrowed her brow, concentrating. "That sounds easy." "It does." "And is it?" Eadwan smiled. "Some days, yes, and other days it's nearly the whole of what I have to do in the world." Sorsha thought about that for a moment, very serious. "Then it really is a good promise." That afternoon, walking back along the high road, Eadwan felt that the girl's words had left a kind echo. A good promise was not the one that sounded beautiful, but the one that truly stayed with you. Weeks later, the village received visitors. They were not complete strangers. They came from an inland village 2 days' journey away, bringing cheese, carded wool, and news of upcoming fairs. Among them was a young woman named Ailbe, with dark eyes and a quiet voice, who stayed several days at Muir in the baker's house. She had recently lost her mother, and though she kept her composure, she carried around her a silent grief. You could feel the way you feel the cold of a stone in the shade. Eadwan met her at the communal oven, where both were helping to take out loaves. Ailbe worked well, but seemed to do everything half a step behind herself, as though her thoughts were walking somewhere else. "You can sit for a moment," Eadwan told her, seeing her lean quietly against the wall. "I'm fine." It was the usual answer of someone who does not want to become a burden. Eadwan remembered her second promise. Do not rush another person's fear. Do not push another person's grief either, she understood now. She simply offered her a cup of warm water with honey. "Sit down anyway, just so the bread doesn't think we're watching it impatiently." Ailbe gave a small smile. She sat down. She took a sip. "In my village there's no well like yours," she said after a while. "You've heard of it?" "Everyone speaks a little of it when they pass through." Eadwan wiped flour from the table with her palm. "Many believe it's a place of miracles." "And isn't it?" Eadwan thought before answering. "It depends on what you call a miracle. It doesn't change the truth of things, but it helps you carry them." Ailbe looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon was clear and windy. "That would be enough for me." The following day, Eadwan accompanied her to the ash tree. The visitor walked in silence, her hands tucked inside her shawl. Once there, she took a long while to step closer. The village continued its life around them. A cart creaking in the square, a hammer at the forge, a pair of children chasing an old wheel. And yet beneath the tree, a separate stillness seemed to open. Ailbe rested her fingers on the stone. "I don't know what to promise," she whispered. Eadwan remembered the same uncertainty in her own voice months before. "Something small," she answered. "Something you can hold even on a bad day." The woman closed her eyes. When she spoke, it was barely above a breath. "I promise not to look away every time I think of my mother. I promise to stay a moment longer with her memory, even when it hurts." Eadwan felt that this was a very courageous promise. She left Ailbe alone for a moment. a few steps away, looking at the new leaves of the ash tree against the sky. Then they walked back slowly. During the days that followed, the visitor seemed to change in a very subtle way. She did not stop being sad, but the sadness no longer carried her with the same current. She was more present, she helped in the kitchen, she went out for walks. One evening she even sang an old song, very softly, while they were putting away cups. Before leaving, she embraced Eadawan by the road. "Your well has not taken my grief away," she said. "It doesn't know how to do that." "No, but it's given me back something like a spine." Eadawan understood perfectly. When the cart with the visitors disappeared into the hedgerows, the young woman stayed a while looking at the empty road. The sun was warm on the stones. The sea in the distance shone like a sheet of pewter. She understood then something else about the well. The quiet courage it gave back did not belong only to the one who made the promise. It spilled a little onto others too. Because a person who learns to hold with humility their own fear, their waiting, their grief, or their tenderness, makes the world around them a little more livable. That afternoon, coming home, she found Thomas and Brid arguing amiably about whether it was time to sow yet, or whether to wait another week. The light came in at an angle through the window and filled the kitchen with golden dust. The smell of damp earth mingled with the smell of bread. Eadawan stood a moment in the doorway without speaking, and she felt a strange fullness, made not of great events but of the simple gathering of modest things. A house still standing, two beloved voices, a familiar road, a well at the center of the village, a heart that still knew how to tremble but would no longer let the trembling be entirely in charge. Continue. Spring passed, and then summer began with its long light. The afternoon stretched out until very late. The sea grew less severe in color, though not in character. Along the roadsides, pink foxgloves and harebells flowered. Children ran barefoot when they could. Women brought chairs into the sun to shell peas. Men worked with the relief of not having mud to their ankles. Everything seemed wider under that luminous season. A year had now passed since Eadawan had first made her true promise. She herself could hardly believe it, not because time had flown, but because looking back she could see clearly the inner distance she had traveled. She was still someone sensitive to change, to uncertain news, to the fragility of beloved things. She still felt the old knot on some days, but now she recognized it as part of herself, not as a master. She had learned to give it space without giving it the whole house. In early June, the village prepared for the summer gathering at the well. It was one of the most cherished meetings of the year. It did not have the inward depth of Samhain or the delicate hope of Imbolc, but it had a clear gratitude, as if the most generous light of the calendar invited you to remember what had grown through small cares. From early morning, the coping was decorated with linen ribbons and wildflowers. Not many, just enough for the place to seem dressed for celebration without losing its simplicity. The ash tree was full of leaves. Its shadow was round and alive. The hum of bees could be heard in the hedgerows, and the murmur of the well seemed cooler in that gentle warmth. Every neighbor came with a new promise or the renewal of an old one. Miren promised to rest one full afternoon a week, and not to mistake exhaustion for virtue. Seamus promised to ask for help when something weighed too heavily on him. Thomas promised to write a brief letter every time he had to leave the village for work, even if only to the neighboring town. Breed promised to let others carry the bucket when her hands had already done enough work. Sorsha, the freckled girl, promised to listen to her little sister all the way to the end of her stories, even when they seemed to start in the middle. There were quiet smiles, bright eyes, hands on the stone. When it came to Eadawan, everyone felt quiet as always, without any special solemnity, but with that attention born of shared affection. She stepped up to the coping and laid her palm on the warm surface of the stone. She felt its familiar roughness, the shadow of the ash tree moving across her skin, the June air full of grass and salt. She thought of her first promise. She thought of the breaths of so many days. She thought of Meir ill, of Tomas's return, of Breed's fever, of I'll be at the oven, of the children learning to offer something small and true. And she said, I promise to keep breathing slowly when fear comes to visit. I also promise to recognize the quiet courage in others, not to walk past it as though it were a small thing. She fell silent. That second part had come to her that very morning, watching her father rise early to mend the wheel without making noise, watching Breed accept an arm when stepping down, watching a child apologize without being told to. She understood that the village was full of tiny acts that almost no one named, yet which held the houses together the way stones hold up walls. She let fall into the well a small ring of braided grass. The water answered with a deep, clear echo. Later there was simple food shared in the square. Dark bread, butter, cheese, baked apples, fresh milk. Someone played the fiddle slowly. The twins sang an old melody about a queen of the west who talked with the seals at dusk. The children chased each other until they were exhausted. The shadows grew long. Everything had that beauty that does not claim to be remembered and, for that very reason, remains. As night fell and the village began to close in on itself, Eadwyn went back to the well alone. She liked that moment after the gatherings, when only a few slightly drooping flowers remained, the trace of footsteps in the earth and stillness recovering its place. The sky was stained a deep blue. The first star appeared above the sea. From several houses came muffled voices and the sound of dishes being put away. Eadwyn sat in the grass beside the ash tree. She had nothing urgent to ask for. No great fear pressed on her that day. She only wanted to be. She thought about the legend that had perhaps given rise to the well, the ancient woman who would have understood many centuries ago that life is not sustained by iron oaths but by faithful gestures repeated. She thought of how many hands must have touched that stone before hers, of how many people must have whispered similar things, to be a little more kind, a little more patient, a little more courageous, before the ordinary. Then she heard soft footsteps behind her. It was Bread. The old woman came leaning on her stick, but with a sure step. She sat down beside her with a small sigh. I knew I'd find you here. Like always. Like almost always. They sat in silence. The night smelled of warm grass cooling, of distant smoke and sea. After a while, Breed asked, Do you know why the well gives back quiet courage, and not something else? Eadwyn rested her cheek on her knees. Because the loud things already know how to look after themselves. Breed let out a low laugh. Good answer, but there's another. The young woman looked at her. What is it? The old woman looked at the coping, the dark leaves of the ash tree, the first thin line of mist in the distance. Because true courage rarely arrives making noise. It comes when a mother rises before dawn, even when she is tired. It comes when a man admits a fault without defending himself. It comes when someone accompanies a grief without trying to erase it. It comes when a young woman learns to breathe before obeying her fear. The well gives that back because that is what is most needed for living among others. Eadwyn listened without moving. She felt those words fall inside her with the same patience with which water wears through stone. Then the whole village has been drinking from that for years, she said. For generations. And if one day it were forgotten, Bread shook her head gently. As long as someone remembers to make a small promise, it won't be entirely forgotten. The two of them fell silent again. Far down in the depths, the water seemed to be keeping stars. Eadwyn understood then that the well was not only a place in the village, it was a way of being in the world. To promise little but keep it with tenderness. Not to ask for a life without fear, but for a heart that does not shrink too much before it. The trust that the sum of many small acts can become an invisible shelter, like the dream of threads she had on the night of Samhain. On the way home, she rested her hand for a moment on the coping and murmured a wordless gratitude. The ash tree answered by moving its leaves with a sound like a blessing. And so life continued in Silronan, with winters and summers, with homecomings and farewells, with loaves that sometimes burned on the bottom, and letters that arrived late, and children who grew up, and elders who one day finally rested beneath the soft earth of the small cemetery facing the sea. But the well remained, and with it, the humble custom. When someone lost their patience, they promised to speak more slowly. When someone was widowed, they promised to open the window every morning so the house would not forget the air. When a girl was afraid of the night, she promised not to run when the candle was put out. When a young man had to embark for the first time, he promised not to leave without embracing his mother. When a woman felt grief clouding her chest, she promised to sit in the sun a few minutes and let the light touch her. And the well, faithful to its gift, gave back its own. No fanfare, no wonders, only that quiet courage that makes it possible to prepare a soup, tell the truth, ask forgiveness, wait for news, care for someone ill, weep without collapsing, and begin again the next day with a gentler hand. Many years later, when Edowin already had a few silver threads in her hair and the village girls came to her to learn to sew and to listen, it was she who first brought a small child to the ash tree. It was her great niece with enormous eyes and crooked boots. The girl was frightened because the following day she would have to sleep alone in her new small bed. "I don't want to be afraid," she whispered, clutching Eadowin's skirt. The woman crouched down to her level. She smiled with the sweetness only those have who have made of fear an old acquaintance rather than a monstrous enemy. "You don't need to promise not to feel it," she said. "That would be too much. Promise something smaller." The girl thought with a touching seriousness. At last she stepped up to the well and said, "I promise to stay still for a moment before I call for Mum." Eadowin felt her heart fill with a tenderness that was almost luminous. Yes, that was how it was, that small, that powerful. And while the sea wind moved through the branches of the ash tree and the ancient water listened in its serene darkness, Silronan kept breathing, house by house, promise by promise, sustained by the humble magic of those who dare to offer not great deeds, but the possible kindness of a single true gesture. On quiet nights when the moon left the line of silver across the Atlantic and the chimneys went dark one by one, some people said the well sang. It was not a song that could be heard with the ears, it was more like a feeling, a gentle certainty. Like knowing that the world, despite its roughness and its mystery, still keeps places where small things matter, where a promise to breathe slowly can change a life, where kindness counts as an offering, where courage is not measured by the noise it makes, but by the tender silence with which it holds others. And in that small village, between the sea and the tall grass, beneath the ash tree with its deep roots, the well went on keeping all those humble words for generations, giving back in return what it knew best to give. A quiet courage, a gentle steadiness, a light small enough to fit in a hand, and steady enough to accompany someone, step by step, to rest.